Well, gentlemen, I appreciate that applause, but you should probably hold off. You might want to do something besides applaud when I get done. I'm going to talk today about industrializing the economy of the antebellum South. For some of you, that might seem like an oxymoron. I have no intention of trying to say that the antebellum South was an industrial hub, but things were happening in the 1840s and 50s that were fascinating to me, and I hope that you might find some things interesting. Now, as most of you know about me, technology and I don't really get along too well, and so I don't have any training aids. It's just me. Thus, I'm not going to divulge you and throw numbers at you, lots of numbers. There are going to be a few numbers at the beginning just to get set. Now, the numbers I'm going to give you date from 1860. To transpose those into numbers today, you have to multiply by 40. So, for example, I say that the amount of capital invested in industry in the antebellum South was $164 million. To make that sense today, you have to multiply it by 40, but I'm going to use 1860 monies. Now, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about numbers to start with, to set the stage. Then I'm going to talk a bit about individuals. Then I'm going to talk mostly about the role of slavery in Southern industry, how it worked, and in fact, it did work. Let's start with numbers. The capital invested in industry in the South, 1840 was only $53 million. By 1860, it was $164 million. It jumped up enormously. And look at the value of industrial products. It increased 80% in the 1850s to a total of $187 million. Now, that pales beside the value of the agricultural products, which were $525 million. And even though the Southern investment in manufacturing was going up, it was paltry compared to the nation. Only 15% compared to the nation. Only 15% of the money invested in manufacturers in the South. And what I'm going to try to do is not to persuade you, as I said at the outset, that we've sort of been overlooking some great industrial behemoth. No, but to notice what's happening in the Southern economy. And let's start with railroads, because as all of you, I'm sure, learned a long time ago, railroads are the bellwether of industry. Industries don't really get started without railroads. And Southern started on railroads. As a matter of fact, some of you may have forgotten that in 1831, the longest railroad in the world went from Charleston, South Carolina to Hamburg, South Carolina, which is across the river from Augusta. 136 miles long. It was the longest railroad in the world at that time. People don't, some of you may have forgotten that, but that was true. And railroads, they built railroads and railroads. The mileage quintupled in the 1850s, from a little over 2,000 to over 10,000. And it varied widely across the states. Virginia had 1,700 miles of railroads. Arkansas had 38 miles of railroad. So it varied widely. But what's also important about the railroads, funding. Where did the money come from? So much of the money came from government, from states and localities. The states put in the 1860, the states had put in over $80 million. And multiply that by 40. You see, we're talking about a good bit of money. At that same time, the localities had put in some $55 million. Remember, here in the state of Georgia, the Western Atlantic Railroad, which went from Atlanta to Chattanooga and helped make Atlanta a railroad hub, was built by the state of Georgia. Public money built it. The state owned the railroad. It owned the railroad. And the Southerners kept trying to build, they wanted to cross the mountains to try to tap the Ohio Valley. They never got through the Appalachian Mountains, and you can see one remnant of that now up above Walhalla, South Carolina, is a Stump House Tunnel. It's a state park up there, city park, state park. The remnant, you can walk into the tunnel. They never got through the mountains. First, they started in the 1830s, but the depression that came late in the 30s stopped it. In the 50s, they got started again, ran out of money, and then the war came. So they never managed to push through the mountains to tap the Ohio Valley. But the point is, they were trying, and it all had to do with industrial growth. Now, let's look for a bit at people. We'll talk about three people. One man named William Gregg. He was the first industrialist in the South to really do something. He was born in Virginia. As a young man, he moved to Charleston, South Carolina, became a jeweler. Then, in the middle of the 1840s, he took a trip to New England. And he was blown away by the textile village, the textile mill in the villages. He said, I'm going to do that. He came back to South Carolina, and in 1845, he published an essay called Essay on Domestic Industry, in which he just, it's like a chamber of commerce. We've got to do this. This is the way, this is the future, this is the future. And what he did, the little town of Graniteville is across the river from Augusta. Today, it's just east of what is now North Augusta. He built a textile mill. Not only a textile mill, he built a mill village, just like in New England. Houses for the workers, church, school, and such. And there were rules. You had to go to school, no dancing, no drinking. You had to go to work if you came there. But now, one thing about William Gregg, this was only for white workers. He wanted, he said, to help the poor farmers, the small landowners, those who had no land. He wanted to give them a place to come and work and prosper. He didn't want any slaves involved in his workforce. Now, that's one way to go, and that's William Gregg. And Gregg's Graniteville, you can go there and see it now. It made money all the way to 1860. It was a profitable operation. And it was just the first. Other textile mills were built in South Carolina, in North Georgia, in North Alabama, and in North Carolina. But Gregg was the first. He was the first. Next, let's look at a man named Joseph Anderson. Anderson was also a Virginian, but he stayed in Virginia. Little time in the Army, he'd been to West Point. He was in the Army, came back. In the early 1840s, he went to work at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond on the James River. It was a small operation. Virginia at that time had a number of iron mills, especially in the Shenandoah Valley. Up and down the Shenandoah Valley, it's a lot of small iron works. Well, Anderson got there in Tredegar. One of the first problems he had, some of the white workers went on strike. What did he do? He brought slaves in. He brought slaves to work. And from then on to 1860, slaves made up the bulk of the workforce at Tredegar. Now, the skilled labor up at the top, the managers, the bosses were white. A lot of the workers at the bottom, the people who actually did the work, were slaves. And Tredegar by 1860 was one of the most modern and important iron works in the United States. They did things like they made cannon for the United States Navy. For railroads, they made rails. They even made locomotives. It was a phenomenal operation, and it was run with slave labor, by and large. And the last person I want to talk about, in some ways, is the most interesting to me. This was a man named Daniel Pratt. Was born in New Hampshire. At age 20, 1819, he came to Georgia. Started off in Savannah as a carpenter. He grew up as a carpenter, moved up into Middle Georgia as a carpenter. Then in 1831, he went to work for a fellow who made cotton gins in Jones County in the town of Clinton. And his partner really liked what Pratt did. Moved him up to superintendent. Now, Pratt's now 30 years old. He and his partner decided they had to follow the future. Cotton frontier was moving west, Alabama, Mississippi, even crossing the Mississippi River. So Pratt became the man who would go west. He went west, just beyond Montgomery on the Alabama River. He established a little town called Prattville. Prattville is still there. And at Prattville, Daniel Pratt really did the same thing that William Gregg had done. He made a mill village. And his main product, cotton gins. In fact, Daniel Pratt at Prattville manufactured 75% of all the cotton gins made in the antebellum, made in the South by the end of the 1850s. But he didn't only do cotton gins, there was also some textiles there. And labor, he used free labor and slave labor, both free and slave. Now, you will find slave labor and other tobacco, lumber mills, flour mills. And think about going west beyond Texas. Southerners wanted to go west, and some Southerners believed, slavery could flourish out there. Take a man like Jefferson Davis. He really thought that slaves would do well out there building railroads and working in mines. That just because you left cotton country didn't mean that you left economic possibility with slave labor. And you mustn't think that people like Gregg and Anderson and Pratt were somehow alone, that they somehow were running ahead of everybody else. There was great public involvement. Just remember the money invested in railroads by states and by localities. And then in the 1850s, the most prominent periodical in the South was a magazine called DeBow's Review. It was put out by a man named James DeBow, who grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, became a lawyer, and then decided he wanted to get into the magazine business. But he didn't want to stay in Charleston. He wanted something that was booming, growing. He went to New Orleans. In 1846, he brought out DeBow's Review. And DeBow's Review, from the late 40s all the way down to 1860, was a boom for the South. Boom South, boom South. Slavery was great. Agriculture was terrific. Industry was terrific. The South was going to prosper. It could prosper with the slave labor and industry. It could prosper with slave labor and agriculture. He saw no conflict whatever between industry and agriculture. Didn't attack agriculture. They weren't backward or wrong. But industry, you had to welcome industry as well. And they both could flourish side by side, and neither was a threat to the slave economy or to the slave society. Then, starting in the 1830s and growing every year, there were Southern commercial conventions. These commercial conventions were held in various cities across the South, and the attendees came from every state. Again, these commercial conventions were pushing Southern commerce, the Southern economy, including industry. They were pushing, pushing, pushing. Obviously then, there was a great deal of white unity behind this drive to add industry to the Southern economy. Not that they wanted to turn away from agriculture. There's none of that. But they wanted to add industry to it. They thought industry would help the Southern economy, help Southern prosperity. Clearly, there was a big change by the middle of the 19th century from the Jeffersonian agrarianism, which said that you could only have farms, that industry was bad for the society and bad for everybody involved. Now, I'll never stand up here and say there were no Southerners who didn't believe that were still agrarian-minded, but the thrust was clearly elsewhere. The thrust was clearly for those people who followed James DeBow, and as I said, DeBow, his periodical was the most widely read in the South, the most notable in the South in the 1850s. Now, I want to stop now and talk clearly about slavery and slavery in industry. Obviously, slaves worked in industry and worked successfully. In 1860, there were probably close to 250,000 slaves involved in industrial endeavors. Total number of slaves, 4 million. So we got a small percentage, but it's a sizable number. And they worked in both skilled positions and unskilled positions. And at a place like Tredegar, they might start in an unskilled position, but they would work to skilled positions. And the way that slaves were brought to a particular enterprise, bought. They would go buy slaves to come work, or they would hire them. I'll give you a concrete example of hiring. I said earlier that the Valley of Virginia was started with small ironworks. And most of those ironworks use slave labor or a combination of slave and free labor. And what the ironworks people would do after the farming season was over, early fall, they would go to Eastern Virginia, where the slaves had nothing to do. They would hire them, pay the owners, take the slaves back across the mountains into the valley, where they would work in the iron mills. The iron work, well, mill is kind of the wrong, iron works. Iron works is better than iron mills. Iron works. So they would hire slaves, and even a place like Tredegar would use hired slaves sometime. And then like in Richmond, which was in many ways the industrial capital of the South, for example, Richmond had 52 tobacco factories. And in those tobacco factories, some 5,000 slaves toiled. Now, they were both hired and owned. And it might interest some of you, the hiring of slaves brought about a change of business practice. Because if you hired somebody's slave, I went out and I hired your slave, suppose something happened to the slave. He was hurt, he was killed. There's value. I'm liable. Insurance. They began to take out insurance on the slaves. For a whole business grew up to insure the hired slaves, because if something happened, the man who hired the slaves had to pay the slave owner the value of the slave. And just look at the whole universe of Southern industrial endeavor. I've already talked about Tredegar probably more than I should have. Tredegar had over 100 slaves working in 1860. In the Richmond tobacco factories, I've said there were over 5,000. They worked in places like the Brick Works in Biloxi, Mississippi, fisheries in Albemarle Sound, North Carolina, and everywhere on railroads, and every possible conceivable position on railroads, you would find slaves, and in mines, like southwestern Virginia, in mines. So you had slave labor working across the spectrum of Southern industry. And there was not a problem. There was no difficulty in using slaves. There was no difficulty in control of slaves. None. And so what do you say at the end? Yes. If you look at the South in 1860, there was tremendous industrial and agricultural growth. The place was really prosperous. In fact, you can make an argument that one of the reasons the Southerners were so confident in 1860, or why so many of them were so confident they could go it alone, was the decade had been so prosperous. And they were doing so well, both in the industrial growth and, of course, the dominant agricultural sector as well. Cotton was booming. The price of cotton stayed up all through the decade of the 50s, though production exploded. Price stayed up. Now, is there any way to talk about limits on this industrial growth in the South? Well, one thing you have to consider, industries make things for people to buy. The South had not many towns and cities, comparatively speaking. And so the market could end up being limited. And again, I'm not trying to say that this was some sort of, Hollywood kind of thing that all was perfect, not at all. But what I'm trying to suggest to you, that the antebellum South, the economy of the antebellum South was a bit more complicated than we normally think about. All we think about is cotton fields and sugarcane fields or tobacco fields. No, indeed. There were mills, and the slave force could work in these mills, work effectively and efficiently, and Southerners, the white Southerners, had no problem with that. By far, the majority had no problem with that. And they looked to the future with optimism, both in the field and the factory. Thank you very much. I will be very glad to address any questions you have. I learned a long time ago never to say answer questions, because a lot of times I can't answer them. But I'll address them.
Bill, was most of the product created in the South stay in the South, or was there any exports to Britain in particular or other places?
In terms of the industrial product, most of the industrial product was not exported to Great Britain. At that time, for example, take textiles. The South share of the textile market was minuscule. New England was still dominant. the South didn't take over the textile world until the 1880s and 90s. So most didn't, and you know, the tobacco went everywhere now. The tobacco products went abroad. The railroads, the bricks works, all that stuff was mostly at home. And Tredegar, one of Tredegar's biggest customers, the United States government. You know, they built cannon for the Navy and so forth, and railroads. But in terms of export to Britain, no, or abroad, no.
Bill, were these businesses typically incorporated, and could a corporation legally own slaves, and kind of how did that fit with the philosophical
Cannot
justification for
answer
slavery?
that sort of legal question because I don't know. I don't know whether they were corporations to be sure, and what the legal ownership of the slave, whether like at Tredegar, whether Joseph Anderson owned slaves, Tredegar owned the slaves. But now what Tredegar's legal organization was, I can't tell you because I don't know.
I mean, it seems like the relationship between the slave owner and the slave, kind of the paternalistic justification for slavery, loses some of its force if you're talking about
You
a
can certainly
corporate.
make that argument. You can certainly make that argument. But of course, a man like Anderson would say he was in charge of the slaves in the factory, in the ironworks, even though the Tredegar might own them, he was there with them every day. So he would argue that he was there.
Bill, your comment about the railroads in the South, or your explanation of the importance of the railroads in the South is very interesting. Do I remember correctly that there was, perhaps after the Civil War, there was imposed on the South, or there was a creation of a different gauge of railroad or something? Is it between the North and the South, and that one of the, to stop?
Well, they did have different, they did have different gauges, but I can't answer the question specifically because I don't know.
Okay, that's
See, I
fine.
told you at the outset, a lot of questions I can't answer. Yeah, wait a minute, Larry, back there. They lived on the premises. There were slave quarters on the premises, so they lived right there. They were owned by Tredegar. And of course, some were hired, but they would be hired by Tredegar and owned. So suppose they might have hired them from you. So you're the owner, but they work at Tredegar and you're paid like they rent them, okay? Hired slaves are like rented slaves.
Bill, I can answer the question about the railroads.
Good.
The
Good.
Railroads in the South, I think typically were 5-foot gauge as opposed to 4 foot 8.5 inches for some strange reason. And I know that created a real problem for transportation between the North and South. So oftentimes those trains would come to some, after the Civil War, for example, come to some town in the South, and they would have to offload the goods from the Northern Railroad onto the Southern Railroad. And I can't remember the year the Illinois Central ran from Chicago south, and it bought up the southern component, and it changed the gauge all in one day, I think it was, for the South, back to 4 foot 8.5 inches. And
Thank you, George. I appreciate it.
yeah, I
Thank
do
you.
have a question about one. Do you know anything about the ironworks at Emerson, Georgia? up to
No.
the Northeast? And second question is, where were the southern cannons made? Were they all made in the Shenandoah Valley, or were they imported?
no.
Or-
The Shenandoah Valley, those ironworks were very small. They didn't make things as big as Shenandoah. Tredegar made most of the cannons that the South had. Of course, the South had cannons that were there in the military before the war began.
Right.
Before the war began. But the small ironworks couldn't make things like cannons.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I always enjoy you, Bill.
Oh,
Bill, where did the capital come from, other than the state contributing capital in the railroads, where you had these
investors,
mills developing,
private investors,
were they coming from the money coming from the north? Was it coming from?
north, the south, anywhere they could get the money, but private investors. a guy like William Gregg, for example, he put up most of his money, but he got other investors in the state to come in with him to help build his Graniteville mill. And when Graniteville started turning a profit, then he got more people to come in.
I have one comment about the railroad widths. In Troup County at LaGrange, Georgia, they had the Atlanta West Point Railroad. It was
Yep.
operating when I was a kid. In the 1850s, Alabama wanted to bring a railroad from Montgomery to West Point. And people all invested in it. The governor sponsored it over there. And the railroad arrived, and it was a different gauge from the railroad from Atlanta.
Yep.
So they had to take all the goods off, which meant the little town of West Point boomed up to about 20,000 people and had a opera house and a hotel. And it was one of the things that stirred that industry. And then they built mills, some before the Civil War, all down the river valley on the Alabama side, all the way to Columbus, where the fall.
I did know that there was a change there, because when Jefferson Davis went to Montgomery, when he was a provisional president, he went from Jackson, Mississippi. He had to go up to Tennessee, cross Tennessee to Chattanooga, down to Atlanta, from Atlanta to West Point. Then he changed to go to Montgomery. That's the way you couldn't go from Jackson, Mississippi, due east to Montgomery, Alabama. He had to go up and all around to get there.
We claim in our family in West Point that he spent the night out at the farmhouse.
I can't answer that. Yes, Joy?
Thank you. Nancy Langan Astor, Lady Astor, her father made a fortune building railroads in Virginia, lost a fortune due to the Civil War, made a second fortune repairing and rebuilding railroads in Virginia. So,
Not surprised. Yes?
Was slavery a deterrent to capital from Europe coming into the South?
No, not before the Civil War.
There was
was
no,
not.
there was no, well, when did the fact of slavery affect the ability of the South to raise capital? Was it, you say it's after the?
It didn't really adversely affect the South economically before the Civil War.
Mhm.
Yes, England had abolished slavery in its colonies in the 1830s. Yes, England was opposed to slavery, but England was also very interested in economic growth and prosperity. The textile industry in England was vital. All the cotton at that time came from the American South, and 90% of it did.
Mhm.
And that's one reason the Southerners were confident about the Civil War, that England could not possibly
Mhm.
let them go down, because England's economy would evaporate. So the English with money were happy to put their money where they could make more money.
So commerce trumped morals.
Well, everybody in England was not anti-slavery. The South had a lot of supporters in England, especially in the upper classes.
Bill, I'm curious as to how much industry came and prospered in Louisiana. Would you know?
In Louisiana, there was very little industry in Louisiana. The climate was up in the lower part of the state. Terrain was not conducive to build factories at all. It was so marshy and muggy and such. And the sugar was just absolutely exploding in the 1850s. There was no place to put many factories. So you don't find much industry in Louisiana, no. Even in the upper part of the state, which was cotton country, no.
Bill, I got a question. You're mentioning insurance on slaves. How did pricing on slaves work? And what would be the average price of a?
Well, that varied. The way it was judged was a prime field hand, which would be a male 25 to 30 years old in good working order. His value would be, everything would stem from that. And I didn't write down the value. Let me see if I can remember. Gosh, it was something like $700 in 1860 money.
So times 40.
Yeah, roughly $700. Now, don't hold me to that, because it could be off a bit for a prime field hand. Of course, the price of slaves would vary from place to place, depending on demand and the market and so forth. Yes?
What were the different energy sources for these, sites, mills, plants, and did it vary based on what they were doing?
They used a lot of water power. Tredegar's on the James River in Richmond, where the water begins to change. Graniteville was on the Savannah River, right at the Savannah River and outside of Augusta. So water power was a big thing. Now, of course, for the trains, coal, and they began to use coal in other places. But they tried to put the textile mills where there was water. Now, even the ironworks in Virginia, in the Valley of Virginia, most of those ironworks, you can see some remnants of some of them even today, were close to waterways. They might be creeks or small rivers, but they were close to where there was water power. They needed either fall line or where they can make it twist and turn to come to them.
Robert?
I'm thinking.
Robert's thinking. Anybody have a question?
I occasionally think before I talk.
Anybody on Zoom have a question? Anybody?
Any more?
Robert's thinking. Robert, did you finish thinking? Robert's thunk out. Okay, Tom?
Was there ever even the slightest mention in the literature of any environmental issues with industrialization, dumping the stuff in the streams and all that?
No environmentalists were about. I can't say no environmentalists about. No environmental movement was about.
Just to,
How did coal mines relate to slavery over in Birmingham in that area?
Well, now Birmingham is post-Civil War. That's an interesting thing about Pratt. I mentioned Pratt. He and his son-in-law developed Birmingham after the Civil War. Son-in-law was a guy named Henry de Bartolabin. They went up there and they developed Birmingham. They were really instrumental in developing Birmingham after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, there was nothing in Birmingham. It's post-war.
when you say that government money was used to build the railroads,
Yes.
the state and local governments, how did they get the money? Was there
Taxes.
taxation,
Well, they did have
income
tax.
tax?
No.
Property?
Most of the tax was on property.
Okay, that's what I was
And they
wondering.
taxed slaves, but the slave tax was very small. The property tax was very small because the state governments didn't do very much. Now, they would issue bonds, but the states didn't do much. You can't think of a state government back then and one now. They didn't do much. They didn't have much to spend money on.
I think most,
What? They got they spent a lot of money.
Sadler, you have a question?
well, I can give a little bit more idea on how it was financed. Railroads were largely financed through bonds issued by local governments.
Yeah, bonds.
It wasn't necessarily the state government, but it was, and so people would buy the bonds and do it. And there was a big thing because a lot of these bonds failed. And there
But
was,
the state did the same thing. The states and local governments issued
Yeah.
bonds.
Tom?
Prime field, you mentioned prime field hands.
That was the term used. I didn't invent that term.
Right, but I'm thinking about slaves that would be rented
Yep.
to industry. Would they generally be older than 30?
Not necessarily. It depends on what was available and what you needed a slave for. If you take in the people would come, the miners, the iron people would come across the mountains in Virginia to Eastern Virginia, looking for workers, hire slaves. The planters there the crops were done. They would be glad to hire out any people they had.
But for only a period.
Oh, yes.
To the next.
The next crop. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Anybody else? Bill, thank you
you
so
very
much.
much.
We really appreciate it. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
This thing off. Thank you, Bill. You're welcome. Thank you.
Well done.
It's okay.
Nice job, Dave.
Once a month. Here and a breakfast club. Yeah. Have you been there?
Yeah, I spoke there. Basketball. A long time ago. And then I spoke to your group. I spoke to the investment group.
I think I had. I think I missed it like before. I apologize. I forgot. I'm pretty sure I missed it. Because Ned had suggested it, and so I think he may have been the one. Yeah. But it's always good to have, we had Bill, speak on,
Yeah, finding speakers is a task.
well, it's easy for me because I've only done 21 months. I got, 4 here and 2 of the record society, so. My 10th year and 1 year assignment.
Well, when I agreed to do this one to replace Max so he could take a break, I didn't realize that I get the 4th and the 5th. Like in January, there's 4th and 5th Fridays, so I get 2 speakers.
You want to rotate that, for it's only how many months? I enjoyed it. I was in Town Road years ago. And, this guy that was the, from Braden, that was the Speaker of the House for a long time. All these people.
Hey, I'll be glad.
And now he wouldn't speak, but he wanted to talk. And then Noah Lang, President Georgia State, oh my God, he was also a Rotarian. So I called. He was All-American at Valdosta State.
Valdosta State.
He went to Harvard for ball. And then he could practice in Valdosta. And then he literally was the one that, started. So I decided, oh man, he'd be great. So I called him out there years ago. And I said, blah, blah, blah. Like, Dr. Langfield. She said, oh, I will, 5 minutes later, Charlie! I get to speak. Noah! Tell me about it. Oh, man, I love come out and talk to you about it. No notion. He was some guy that was, so he said, you gotta come down and pick me up underneath the ladder. Take me out. But then you gotta take me quiet. Once we got once we got home, and we got stopped at the Mexican place, about 6 what? Some guy from just somewhere. Minnesota, visited up there. And he was just blown away. But he didn't get back downtown for some convention. So he said, so I said, I got to Dr. Langford. This guy goes with, and Langford saying something like, I don't know, but I don't know much about Washington. It's not football, it's not like, whatever the Wisconsin Badgers, let's say, whatever it was. And so, I said, well, the Badgers certainly do blah, blah, blah. Just keep it up with all the teams. So I've enjoyed it. But you gotta have something.
If I work for a couple of days, I can line up. Then I take a break.
I'm not that. I don't have it ready for
That was advised.
Yeah.
Wait.
Oh, wait, there's one that I